My brother made my life hell, then got my wife pregnant. Now he wants my help after our parents disowned him and left me their $2 million inheritance. My younger brother David has always resented me. If you think it's because he's jealous, you'd be wrong. He was the favored child, not me. There was no reason for him to be envious. To give you some context, our mother always indulged David. He was the golden child of our family. She cooked his meals. I did his laundry and even helped him with his schoolwork. I was expected to assist him simply because we were family, but I never received the same consideration. I accepted this as I was quite independent. Perhaps it was partly my fault for always meeting his needs without expecting anything in return. He never helped me when I needed it and only approached me when he wanted something. I was a quiet introverted kid who enjoyed studying and keeping to myself. He was loud and rough, just like our dad. I also tend to I'm straightforward and honest, never sugarcoating things. I think my mother may have developed a negative perception of me because of my straightforwardness. This favoritism made David the family's darling, and I didn't mind it while we were growing up. However, problems began when he started bullying and mocking me for being different from him. He would tease me about my height and the fact that I wore glasses. He would sneak into my room, read my diary, and then complain to my mom about what I had written. When I confronted him and complained to our parents about him invading my privacy, they just laughed it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. He did some pretty awful things, like nearly breaking my glasses and putting nasty things in my food. He even once put little stones in my cereal, but luckily I found them before they could damage my teeth. When I told my mom, she brushed it off, saying this is how brothers bond. Whenever we fought, David would zero in on my insecurities to insult me. He was in the same school, so he knew I was being bullied by a few kids instead of supporting me. He sided with the bullies, calling me names like ugly loser or hairy monkey, and encouraging them to physically harm me. He said I was just a big failure. Another time during a fight over something trivial that I can't even remember, he told me to kill myself. I could easily brush off most insults, but that one really hurt because I was struggling with my mental health at the time. Things are better now, but it was pretty rough at the time. I was hearing that my own brother wanted me dead, since my dad was often at work and my mom didn't seem to care much. She even scolded me once, claiming it was my fault for irritating him. Things got worse during high school. There was a shocking incident when David tried to set my hair on fire. Unbelievably, our mother defended him, claiming he was just playing. Seriously, who behaves like that? Thankfully, my dad eventually sided with me and pointed out the gravity. My dad even threatened to call the police on David. This was a real eye-opener for my brother, as he'd never faced any consequences for his actions before. He was genuinely stunned, and my dad made it clear that enough was enough and that David needed to start respecting his older brother. Later, my dad came into my room to talk. I'd never expected his support because he always told David how similar they were, which was true. Dad admitted that he'd waited for years hoping David would mature, but he was slowly realizing that David was becoming a big bully. Hearing this from my dad was incredibly validating. I almost broke down in tears. I told him everything David had done to me over the years, even mentioning the bullying at school. My dad was shocked at how much I had endured. The next day, he spoke to the principal to ensure the bullies were warned about severe consequences if they continued. Later that evening, he enrolled me in MMA at our local gym, telling me I needed to stand up to bullies in my life. I'll admit that a nerdy kid like me trying to learn to fight might have seemed laughable, but I was very focused. I managed my time well to balance my studies and daily workouts. The MMA classes completely changed my life in terms of my physique. One day, David was up to his usual antics. He stole my pocket money, which we received for helping with chores. I had been saving it for a while. David sneaked into my room and took it. I caught him just as he was about to cycle off with his friends. I asked him to give me back my money, but David said I could only ask my dad for help. I don't know what made me do it, but I punched him in the face. He was surprised, stumbled back, and I took my money from his pocket and threw him back down. David started crying, which was pretty funny. My mom came out to help him and find out what happened. When she found out I'd fought him, she was surprised and told me I should be a better role model. David seemed to enjoy seeing me get in trouble. He also complained to my dad about my behavior, saying I needed to be controlled. My dad asked both of us to explain ourselves. I told him how David had stolen the money I had worked hard for and saved, while David tried to justify it by saying he needed the money for a date and that as his brother I should help him. However, my dad told David he was lucky I only punched him for stealing because anyone else would have called the police. He kept on telling David that he had no right to take things from others without their permission. David didn't like that and threw a tantrum, probably hoping our mother would side with him, but Dad stayed strong when David realized he wasn't going to be punished for being hit. He started screaming how much he hated me and ran back to his room, locking himself in. After that, David started to distance himself from me. He had finally understood that he couldn't bully me anymore and that even Dad had stopped supporting him. His antics were a bit surprising, but I felt like we were on equal footing for the first time in a while. He couldn't physically harm me anymore, so he resorted to verbal insults when our parents weren't around. His behavior got worse with age, becoming angrier and more short-tempered each year when I approached him with a question. He would ignore me and walk away, muttering insults like nerd or loser under his breath. If he needed to communicate something, he would relay it through our mother instead of speaking to me directly. When I asked my mother why David couldn't just talk to me, she told me to be more understanding. I couldn't tell if it was just puberty or if she was genuinely upset. Dealing with his comments became unbearable, and I wanted to move out and get away from him. I asked my mother to mediate a sit-down conversation for us to resolve our issues, but she always refused, saying she didn't want to get involved. When I asked my mom why David treated me this way, she just brushed off the question. Eventually, I left for my dream university, having earned a scholarship as a top student. My dad threw a party for me, and even my mom seemed proud. However, David remained aloof and distant, barely acknowledging my achievements. The day I left for university was a mix of excitement for the future and relief to escape the toxic home environment. The first few months at university were liberating. I made new friends, enjoyed my classes, and started to build a life separate from the oppressive situation I had been in. The constant fear of David's verbal attacks lifted, giving me a newfound sense of peace during my second year. I met my wife Karen at a frat party through a friend, and we immediately clicked. We both came from religious backgrounds where having kids outside of marriage was frowned upon. However, when we discovered she was pregnant in our final year, we decided to marry right after graduation. Our wedding was a small but joyful ceremony. Our parents were happy for us, and we enjoyed the celebration at that moment. I believed. Karen was the love of my life. I had always envisioned a monogamous relationship, one woman to come home to and share my life with. Despite other women showing interest over the years, I never pursued anything because I was genuinely content in my marriage. Karen was my dream girl, and I never wanted to hurt her. However, I later uncovered 2 incidents of infidelity in our marriage. One was an intermittent affair with her married coworker that spanned several years. The other was a brief fling with an ex. Some might think I was naive, and looking back, I can't completely disagree. Each time we separated for a while, I chose to forgive my wife. I didn't want to raise our child in a broken home and believed we could overcome these obstacles. The affair with her coworker happened when we were young, and I attributed it to youthful mistakes and poor judgment. For a period, things seemed to get better. Although I could never fully trust her again, I did my best. I decided to set aside my doubts and work toward a fresh start. It's been 4 years since her second betrayal, and I felt confident in my decision to give her another chance. Karen seemed to have changed, and we were genuinely happy planning our family's future. However, 3 months ago, my world was shattered once more when she revealed that she had been having a long-term affair and suggested that our son might not be mine. Her words struck me. I was blown away. I was shocked, betrayed, and disbelieving. I struggled to understand how she could keep such a significant secret for so long. I asked her why she kept it and how she could do something so devastating. Her reaction was cold and indifferent, as if she didn't care. Her vague responses left me with more questions than answers. It was a surreal and painful moment. I confronted the shattered trust and uncertainty about my own family. I kept asking Karen, for I felt I deserved to know the father of the child I had been raising since birth. Ultimately, she admitted it was David. I was shocked. I asked Karen what she meant. She explained that she and David had become friends when I introduced her to my family. She stayed with us from Thanksgiving until New Year's. David was usually cold to me, but he was warm and polite towards her, which made me glad because I didn't want Karen to feel unwelcome. Karen wanted to be accepted into my. She spent a lot of time with my mom, and she noticed that David and I didn't get along. She asked me about it, and I told her that we might never get back together because he still had feelings for someone else. Karen understood, but she started including David in our plans. She invited him to watch movies with us, and we did that sometimes. David and I talked to each other a little bit, which was better than him ignoring me. I remember Karen and David hanging out and playing video games together, but I never thought much of it. Karen told me that one day David opened up to her about his struggles in a recent breakup. He felt vulnerable and struck up a friendship with her. She mentioned that he would flirt with her when I wasn't around. Eventually, things escalated beyond her control. The vision of my wife and brother sleeping together made me feel sick. Karen confessed that she felt guilty afterward and left him. This matched her abrupt decision to, instead of spending New Year's with me, she went home. I tried to convince her to stay, but she was adamant about leaving when we met back at college after the holidays. She was her usual cheerful self, so I didn't question anything. 2 weeks later, we found out she was pregnant. Karen admitted she didn't know if the child was mine or David's. With no way to prove it, she chose to stay with me, knowing I was the more dependable brother. This was why we got married. My world felt it was like everything was crashing down. I even started to doubt that the son I loved was even mine. I asked Karen if she had been sleeping with David recently, and she slowly nodded. She revealed that they had always stayed in touch because their chemistry was undeniable. They would sneak off to hotels, lying to me about working overtime. She admitted that half of her business trips were actually romantic getaways with him. I asked why she married me if she wanted my brother, and Karen said she didn't want to be the one to break it off. She saw me as a great dad to our son and decided to stay. She said she made a mistake and didn't know when to stop. I told Karen I was glad she told me the truth, but that I was going to leave. She started crying and asked for forgiveness. I didn't yell at her. I calmly packed my clothes. Karen said that if I loved her, I should fight for her. She said mistakes happen in every marriage. She realized I wasn't going to. She switched tactics, saying our son would be affected by a divorce and that children shouldn't be raised in broken homes. I reminded her that I might not even be the father, which made her cry more and accuse me of being cruel. It seemed like she believed nothing could make me want to leave the marriage. Perhaps it was partly my fault for letting things slide in the past, while I did love her. It felt more like it stemmed from thinking we had a son together and had been together since college. She kept insisting it wasn't too late to fix things, but I struggled to believe her and had no patience left. We had a lot of trust issues, and her words felt hollow. Even if I forgave her, I could never forget she slept with my brother. I've always believed in forgiving mistakes because we're all flawed, but this was beyond the pale. I left her crying on the doorstep and checked into a hotel the next day. I went straight to my parents and revealed everything about my wife's affair. My parents were pretty shocked when I told them about the affair. My mom tried to defend David, saying he couldn't do such a thing to his own brother. I asked my parents to stay silent and let me call David in front of them. I told them to stay quiet so I could catch David off guard. When David answered the phone, I confronted him about the affair. At first, he denied it, refusing to accept any responsibility. However, when I told him that Karen had admitted to everything, he started blaming her, calling her characterless. He said it wasn't his fault if women were attracted to him and that he was the better-looking brother. I told him firmly that I would expose him to everyone. David mocked me, saying no one would believe me because he was the golden child. I thanked him for confirming that the truth had reached our parents' ears. David went quiet, then spluttered as he tried to explain himself and salvage his image. My mother was still in shock and demanded an explanation from David. He stumbled through an attempt to justify his actions, blaming everyone else but himself and trying to shift the blame onto Karen. I could see my mother, who had once been protective of her favored son, now feeling a mix of disappointment and anger in that charged moment. I felt a strange sense of vindication. For years, I had David's torment was now over. The truth was out, and the roles were reversed. It was David who stood exposed, with his actions laid bare for everyone to see. As David's words faltered, my father, who was usually reserved in his expressions, couldn't contain his disappointment. He asked me to pass him the phone and began to speak to David. "David," my father began, his voice laden with disappointment. "What you've done isn't just a betrayal of your brother. It's a betrayal of this family. You slept with you had an affair with your brother's wife even after they were married. Your actions have had a severe impact on our family and have irreversibly shattered the trust we had in you. I raised both of you to value family loyalty and decency. What you've shown today goes against everything I've taught you. I've tried to teach you to respect your brother's feelings and to show respect for his marriage. Your disregard for your brother's feelings and the lack of respect for his marriage are unacceptable. You've not only hurt him but also you've torn apart the bonds that hold our family together. I'll be the first to admit that your mother and I are partly to blame for what you've become. But we've had enough. This behavior is unacceptable, and it's going to stop now. You're cut off from the college funds I set up for you. You'll have to figure out how to pay your university fees on your own. I'll also stop funding your lifestyle. Do you think it makes you more of a man to sleep with married women? Let's see how you manage without my money." I kept my cool, even though I wanted to scream at David watching my dad punish him. It was the ultimate vindication. I had exposed his true nature, and it was clear he had underestimated the consequences. My mother, despite David's persistent protests, continued to justify him. But my father ended the call, shutting down David's attempts to explain away his actions. Afterward, my mom approached me and hugged me. It had been a long time since we shared such a moment, but in that embrace, there was an unspoken understanding and support amid the family turmoil. She apologized for not believing me all this time. My 14-year-old self could never have imagined this moment, being vindicated and embraced by my mother. Following this, my dad helped me find a good lawyer to divorce Karen. She and her lawyer tried to fight dirty, asking for alimony since I earned more than her. However, her affair played heavily in my favor. We also conducted a paternity test, and it was confirmed that David was indeed The news was incredibly painful, even worse than discovering Karen's infidelity. I was furious that the son I had loved and raised wasn't mine. However, I decided to stay strong. Karen begged me to continue visiting my son, arguing he shouldn't be punished for the situation. However, I couldn't bear to see him. He reminded me too much of David, and I hated it. After my divorce was finalized, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me as I moved into my own place. It felt strange to live alone since I had married so young and never really had the chance to experience independence. However, my naturally independent nature allowed me to quickly adapt to my new lifestyle, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. 2 weeks ago, my dad called to tell me he was considering changing his will because he didn't want to leave anything to David. My dad is stubborn, and once he decided to cut David out of his life, he stuck to it. David tried reaching out to our parents and even showed up, but they didn't even let him in to beg for forgiveness. Even my mother, who usually gave in to David's tantrums, seemed done with him. It must have been hardest for her. David never texted me to apologize for what he did. He showed he didn't regret his actions. He was just upset about being cut off from our parents. My dad told me he planned to leave everything to me. He made sure David wouldn't contest it later. He would leave David only $1. My dad had worked hard his entire life, including his assets, retirement fund, and life insurance. The total came to nearly $2 million. The only condition in his will was that if my dad passed away before my mom, she would continue living in their house, even though ownership would transfer to me. I didn't mind this, as I wanted to care for my mom in her final days. Somehow, David found out about this and, unable to reach our parents, called me yesterday. He said he was having trouble paying for college and that Karen had been asking him for child support. He said he didn't have any money and was looking for part-time jobs but couldn't find anything. He asked me to talk to our family and start over since he really needed my help. I told him I wasn't interested and that he should have thought about the consequences. Before sleeping with my wife and getting her pregnant, David argued that I was being unfair and that Karen was also to blame. I agreed. I reminded him that I had divorced her, making her his responsibility. He shouldn't be calling me to complain about her or the child. These were the consequences of his own actions. David started to raise his voice, but I interrupted, reminding him that he was no longer the favored child in the family. He was the black sheep who had slept with his. At that moment, David began to cry, telling me how everyone, including our grandparents and relatives, had turned against him. While this was true, it was no longer my concern. I told him we were done and that he should never call me again since I no longer considered him my brother. Despite my hatred for my brother, I had never heard him cry, at least not since we were kids. I won't lie. It was a bit of a shock to see him so helpless. I'm wondering if I should talk to our parents about him, or if I'm being unfair. Hi everyone, many of you have been asking why I'm no longer in contact with my son Henry. Some have even called me cruel. I need to explain that I'm not comfortable raising another man's child. This isn't a stepchild situation. I was led to believe I thought Henry was my son, but I later found out he's actually my brother David's son. I was really hurt by this and cried for days. The main reason I don't want to have any contact with Henry is that I don't want Karen in my life. If I'm connected to her child, she'll find a way to get back in touch, and I need my space. You might think I'm being cruel or selfish, but I can't see him again. At least not for a very long time. Update 2. Most of you correctly guessed that it was my mother who informed David about my dad changing his will. This led David to call me as a last resort to fix things. I confronted her in front of my dad, and she broke down, saying I had punished David enough and that he had learned his lesson. My dad firmly told my mother that if she believed what David did was forgivable, then he could no longer stay married to her because he could never forgive such a betrayal. This threat silenced my mother. My dad made it clear that if she ever talked with David again, we'd find out, and she'd have to leave. As I said, my dad is very stubborn. Hopefully my mother will learn from her mistakes. Update 3, Reddit. It's been 5 months since my last update. My relationship with my parents has improved over the past few months. My dad and I go golfing every weekend, and he treats me more like my mom misses David, but she stayed away from him. The last I heard, she was avoiding him. My cousin said that David had been asking everyone for money and eventually had to drop out of college because he couldn't afford the fees. He and Karen are living together, and he has a part-time job as a mechanic. They're raising Henry together, which is a good thing. I never discuss David with my parents, and they don't bring I'm doing well at work. I got promoted 2 months ago, so my salary has improved a lot. I'm not dating anyone right now because I feel like I need time to heal. I've been going to therapy, so we'll see how that goes. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more stories from my life.